Hello there, and welcome to the Nightcap Historian. Tonight we are going somewhere cold and salt-bitten, and impossibly far to a world where the ocean was not a barrier but a road, and where men and women navigated by the color of the water and the smell of the wind and the behavior of birds they had memorized since childhood. There were people who looked west across the North Atlantic when everyone else turned away, and what they found there half a millennium before the voyage that history remembered was a continent. The sound of their oars, lifting and falling in the gray swells of an ocean that had no name yet, is the sound this story begins with. Before we begin, I want you to take one slow breath and let it go. Feel the weight of your body settle into whatever is beneath you. Let your shoulders find their natural place. You do not need to carry anything into this hour. Let the wind drop. Let the water go still. You are not at sea yet. You are at the fire's edge, where every voyage begins. Let's go. If you found your way here tonight, whether you have been with us for a long time or this is your first voyage, we are genuinely glad you are here. This channel exists for the restless and the tired and the quietly curious. If it has become part of how you sleep, please consider subscribing so others who need a softer landing can find us too. But for now, let's begin. The Norse people understood the world as a place held together by a single, immense tree. Yggdrasil, the world tree, was not a metaphor to the Norse mind, but a cosmological fact. An enormous ash tree whose roots reached into 3 separate realms and whose branches held 9 distinct worlds. From Asgard, the home of the gods, to Niflheim, the realm of ice and mist at the very bottom of creation. The gods held their councils beneath it. A dragon gnawed perpetually at its roots. An eagle perched in its highest branches, and between the eagle and the dragon a squirrel ran endlessly up and down the trunk, carrying insults from one to the other. Picture a people for whom the entire universe was alive, interconnected, and in a state of constant, barely managed tension. That is the mind that looked at the North Atlantic and decided to cross it. The Norse seafaring tradition was built on a technology so advanced it would not be matched in Europe for centuries. The Viking longship was not simply a boat, it was a solution to a set of engineering problems so elegantly resolved that naval historians still study it with genuine admiration. Its hull was built using a clinker technique, in which overlapping planks were riveted together in a flexible shell that could flex with the movement of waves rather than resist them, distributing stress across the entire structure rather than concentrating it at any single point. The keel was shallow enough to allow the ship to be beached directly on a shore, no harbor required. The same ship could cross open ocean and navigate a river. It could be carried overland between waterways. It was, by any measure, the most versatile watercraft of the early medieval world. The Norse gods were not remote and serene. They were anxious, fallible, and aware that everything they built would eventually end. Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, was not a distant theological abstraction, but a known future event that the Norse cosmos was already moving toward. Odin, the Allfather, collected warriors in Valhalla not for the pleasure of their company, but because he was building an army for a final battle he knew he would lose. Thor would kill the world serpent and die from its venom. Freyr would fall for lack of a sword he had given away. The gods knew this. They held councils about it, worried about it, sought prophecy about it, and went on ruling and feasting and adventuring anyway, because the knowledge of an ending did not make the living less worth doing. That sensibility, courage, without illusion, is woven into everything the Norse people built and every sea they crossed. The society that produced the Viking explorers was organized around the concept of honor, and honor was understood as something actively maintained, not passively inherited. A Norse man or woman standing in their community was not fixed at birth. It was earned, demonstrated, and defended through action, through generosity, skill in craft or battle, the quality of one's word, and the willingness to answer an insult with something more decisive than words. The thing the assembly at which free Norse men gathered to resolve disputes, make law, and render judgment was the institutional expression of this. A community of people who understood themselves as agents rather than subjects. The explorer who crossed an unknown ocean was not departing from his culture's values. He was expressing them. The voyage west was, in some deep sense, simply what a person of honor did when there was horizon left to cross. Norse navigators used a combination of natural phenomena to hold course across open water without magnetic compasses. The magnetic compass did not reach Scandinavia until the 12th century, well after the period of the Great Western Voyages. Norse navigators worked instead with the sun, using a solar-bearing dial, or solar stein, to track the sun's arc, even in overcast conditions, and with the behavior of the natural world around them. Sea color changed over different bottom types. The smell of seaweed and vegetation indicated proximity to land. The direction of swell patterns conveyed information about distant weather systems and land masses. Certain birds, particularly gannets and kittiwakes, were known to range specific distances from shore, so their presence indicated where land lay. Viking ships reportedly also carried ravens, releasing them periodically. A raven that flew in a consistent direction was following the scent of land. The Norse concept of fate word did not reduce human agency but rather gave it weight. Word was not predestination in the Christian theological sense. It was something closer to the grain of things, the pattern already laid into the wood of events, which a person of intelligence and will could read and work with. The three Norns who sat at the base of Yggdrasil and wove the fates of gods and humans were not dispensing arbitrary destiny. They were recording what each being was, given everything that had led to that moment. A Norse explorer setting out across the North Atlantic knew that the voyage might kill him. He went anyway, not because he was reckless, but because to turn away from what the horizon offered was to deny the grain of what he was. Fate, in the Norse imagination, was not a cage. It was a call. Scandinavia's geography made seafaring not a choice but a necessity, and in that necessity, a culture was formed. The Scandinavian peninsula is a landscape of long coastlines, deep fjords, and interior mountains that made overland travel difficult and farming limited. The sea was, for many communities, the primary highway, the way goods moved. Neighbors were reached, and the wider world was accessed. Children grew up in boats. Adults spent significant portions of the year on the water. The sea was familiar, legible, a known environment rather than a feared one. This familiarity bred a specific kind of competence, not bravado, but the quiet, accumulated expertise of people who had read the same water for generations and knew its moods as well as they knew the inside of their own hulls. It was not boldness that took the Norse west. It was habit, extended to an extraordinary degree. Erik the Red, the man who settled Greenland, was exiled from 2 countries before he ever found the place he is remembered for. Erik Thorvaldsson, called Erik the Red for the color of his beard and hair, was born in Norway and followed his father into exile in Iceland after a killing placed the family outside the law. In Iceland, Erik built a farm and a life, and then killed again, this time in a dispute over some borrowed wooden bedboards. The specifics of the quarrel are recorded, which says something about the precision of Norse legal memory, and was exiled from Iceland for 3 years. Rather than wait out his sentence in idleness, he sailed west into waters that Icelanders had reported but never properly explored, spent 3 years mapping what he found, and returned to Iceland to recruit settlers for the place he called, with a salesman's instinct, Greenland. He was, by every measure, a difficult man. He was also, clearly, incapable of staying still. Erik's settlement of Greenland in 985 CE was one of the most audacious colonization ventures in the early medieval world. He set out from Iceland with 25 ships carrying several hundred people, men and women, livestock, tools, timber, and the household goods of families who were bedding everything on a coast none of them had seen. 11 of the 25 ships made it. The other 14 turned back in the face of storms or were lost. Those who arrived found a landscape of dramatic, terrible beauty. Glaciers running down to the sea, narrow fjords of deep water between stone cliffs, coastal meadows green enough in summer to justify the name Erik had given the place. They built long houses from stone and turf, brought their livestock ashore, and began the work of making a home at the absolute edge of the inhabitable world. They stayed. Their descendants would live there for nearly 500 years. The sagas that record these voyages were composed centuries after the events they describe, and that distance is part of what makes them extraordinary. The Vinland sagas, primarily the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Erik the Red, were written down in Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries, describing events that took place around 1000 CE. They existed as oral tradition for 2 or 3 centuries before anyone wrote them down. What survives is therefore not a historical document in the modern sense, but something more interesting, a living memory, shaped by the conventions of saga storytelling, terse, specific, attentive to character, reluctant to explain what it considers obvious, that encodes real events in a form designed to be remembered and retold. The sagas are not mythology. They are not quite history. They are something the Norse world had a specific name for, a true story, told in the way that truth survives. The first European to sight the North American continent was almost certainly not Leif Eriksson, but a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni had been sailing from Iceland to Greenland to visit his father when storms blew him far off course. He sighted land wooded, flat, and not at all like the rocky, glacier-covered coast of Greenland he was expecting 3 times over the course of several days, before finally locating Greenland and completing his journey. He never went ashore. He was a practical man on a practical errand, and the wooded coastline was not what he was looking for. He told people what he had seen when he arrived. The story circulated in the small, interconnected community of Norse Greenland for years before anyone decided to do something about it. Bjarni Herjolfsson, the man who discovered America, went home for dinner. History, as it often does, moved on without him. The Norse longhouse was a feat of insulation engineering designed to keep people and animals alive through subarctic winters. The standard Greenlandic Norse dwelling was a long, low structure built from stone foundations and walls of thick turf sod, cut in blocks from the meadow and stacked like bricks. The grass growing into itself over time until the walls became essentially living earth. The roof was similarly constructed, turf over timber, capable of sustaining its own weight under heavy snow. Animals, cattle, sheep, goats, were frequently housed in an attached byre at one end of the structure, their body heat contributing meaningfully to the warmth of the dwelling. Inside, a central long hearth ran the length of the main room, its smoke venting through a hole in the turf roof. The smell of such a space peat smoke, animal warmth, damp wool, fermented milk is something you can reconstruct from the archaeological record, though experiencing it at 4 a.m. in January is something else entirely. We have come this far together through the world tree and the longship, through Erik's exile in the fjords of Greenland, through the practical merchant who saw a continent and kept sailing. Take a breath here. Let your shoulders soften. Let whatever you have been holding in your body find its way down and out. The sea is still around us, but we are resting on it, not fighting it. The next part of the story is the voyage itself, the crossing that changed what the world knew about itself. Breathe slowly. Let's continue. Leif Eriksson bought Bjarni's ship, assembled a crew of 35, and sailed west to find what Bjarni had refused to land on. The detail of the ship purchase is preserved in the saga of the Greenlanders, and it matters. Leif did not commission a new vessel for this voyage, but bought the actual ship that had made the sighting, the way someone might seek out the specific instrument that had played a particular piece of music. He recruited experienced men. The sagas do not give us most of their names, and he reversed Bjarni's route, sailing west and south until he found the coastlines that Bjarni had described. He found them in order. First, a flat, rocky coast he named Helluland Slabland, which is understood today to correspond to Baffin Island. Then a wooded, sandy coast he called Markland Forest, land, likely Labrador. And then, further south, the place he decided to stay. The name Leif gave to his discovery, Vinland, has been debated for 1,000 years. and the debate has never been fully settled. Vinland means, most literally, wineland or vineland, and the sagas describe Leif's crew finding wild grapes and cutting vines to carry home as proof of the land's richness. But grapes do not grow as far north as Newfoundland, where archaeological evidence places the Norse settlement. Some scholars have proposed that vinbur, the word used, referred not to grapes, but to another berry, lingonberries, perhaps, or gooseberries, which do grow in Newfoundland. Others argue the settlement was a base from which explorers ranged much further south, into regions where grapes genuinely grew. The ambiguity sits at the center of the story like a knot that refuses to loosen a small, persistent mystery inside a larger one. What Leif meant by the name he gave the place, only Leif knew. The voyage from Greenland to Vinland was approximately 3,000 kilometers across the North Atlantic in an open ship in early medieval conditions. The route the Norse explorers took is not precisely recorded, but the likely path ran southwest from Greenland, down the Labrador coast, and around the northern tip of Newfoundland, a passage through waters that in early spring are studded with icebergs calved from Greenland's glaciers, swept by North Atlantic swells, and subject to fog so dense that a navigator loses all reference points within minutes. The temperature of that water, even in summer, is cold enough to kill an unprotected swimmer in less than an hour. The ships were open to the sky for most of their length. The men rowed or sailed, slept when they could in leather sleeping bags, ate dried fish and hard bread and whatever they could catch. The crossing took, by most estimates, around 3 to 4 weeks. They arrived. That, in itself, is worth holding in the mind for a moment. Leif Eriksson wintered in Vinland and built a settlement large enough to shelter his entire crew. The sagas describe Leif constructing large houses. The name preserved is Leif's booths, and spending a full winter in the new land before sailing back to Greenland, laden with timber and the vine cuttings that would demonstrate the richness of what he had found. His behavior during that winter is described as methodical and careful. He organized the exploration of the surrounding territory in groups, ensuring that no one went so far that they could not return by nightfall. One crew member, a southerner named Tyrker, who had been part of the household since Leif's childhood, went missing briefly and returned in a state of considerable excitement. Having found the grapes or berries that would give the land its name, he reportedly spoke German before he spoke Norse when they found him, overcome with something between discovery and joy. Leif scolded him for wandering. He kept the grapes. The Norse longship's sail was as important as its oars, and making it was a community effort that took years. A Viking sail was made from wool, specifically from the fleece of sheep bred for long, coarse fibers woven into a heavy fabric, then treated with a mixture of animal fat and ochre to waterproof and stiffen it. A single sail for a large longship required the wool of several hundred sheep and the labor of skilled weavers working for months or years. The sail was the ship's primary means of propulsion on long ocean voyages, where sustained rowing was impractical. Its distinctive square shape, suspended from a single crossyard, could be trimmed in various ways to sail closer to the wind than its square form might suggest, and the deep keel allowed the ship to hold course against lateral drift. The sail was so valuable that it was often listed separately in estate inventories, like a house or a farm animal. It was not equipment, it was a significant portion of a family's wealth. In Norse cosmology, the world ended at Utgard, the outer realm, beyond the known where giants and chaos held dominion. The Norse world was structured as a series of concentric rings. Midgard, the middle world of humans, surrounded by ocean, beyond which lay Utgard, the outer places where the familiar rules of the human world did not quite apply. The great serpent, Jormungandr, lay in those outer waters, encircling Midgard and biting its own tail. When Thor fished for it, the sea shook. To sail west, across the gray water beyond Greenland, was in the Norse imaginative framework to move toward Utgard, into the outer ring, into the place where certainty thinned and the world's edges grew strange. The men who made those crossings were not indifferent to this. They had grown up with these stories. They went anyway. That is what makes the voyages feel, even now, like something more than navigation. Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, made the second Norse voyage to Vinland and became the first European known to die in North America. Thorvald took a crew of 30 to Leif's wintering houses, spent 2 winters exploring the coastline in both directions, and encountered in his second summer a group of indigenous people sheltering under skin boats on a beach. What happened next is recorded tersely in the sagas. The Norse attacked, killing 8 of the 9 men they found. The 9th escaped. Shortly afterward, a large fleet of skin boats arrived, and in the engagement that followed, Thorvald was struck by an arrow under the arm in the gap between his shield and his body, and knew immediately that the wound was mortal. He reportedly told his crew to take him ashore, bury him at the cape he had chosen as a place he would like to live, and plant crosses at his head and feet. Then he died. The place he named for himself is somewhere on the North American coast, and no one knows exactly where. The indigenous people the Norse encountered, referred to in the sagas as Skrælingjar, were almost certainly ancestors of the Beothuk or Dorset culture people of Newfoundland. The word Skrælingjar is Old Norse, and its exact meaning is disputed. It has been translated as wretches, weaklings, or simply foreigners, depending on the scholar. The sagas describe them as small, dark-skinned, and moving in a way the Norse found unsettling. The detail of the skin boats, upturned on the beach, for shelter is ethnographically consistent with what is known of Dorset and early Beothuk culture. The Norse accounts of these encounters are written entirely from one perspective, which means they capture the Norse experience of contact while telling us almost nothing about the experience of the people being contacted. What we can say is that 2 cultures, separated by an ocean's worth of development, met on a beach in North America around the year 1004 CE, and that the meeting did not go well for either of them in the long run. The Norse indigenous encounters in Vinland followed a pattern of initial curiosity, followed by violence, and the violence ultimately ended the settlement. The early contacts described in the sagas include a period of trade. The Norse exchanged red cloth for furs and other goods, and the exchanges were apparently peaceful and mutually satisfying. But the relationships deteriorated. A Norse bull frightened an indigenous trading party, triggering an attack that the Norse repelled. In subsequent encounters, the violence escalated on both sides. The sagas are clear that the Norse killed people. The attack on the sleeping men under the skin boats is described without apology, and equally clear that the eventual Norse withdrawal from Vinland was driven by the impossibility of holding the settlement against the sustained resistance of a local population they could neither defeat completely nor accommodate peacefully. The settlement that failed on the edge of North America failed for reasons that resonate across the entire subsequent history of the continent. Thorfinn Karlsefni led the largest Norse expedition to Vinland, somewhere between 60 and 160 people, including women and children. Thorfinn Karlsefni was an Icelandic merchant of means who married Gudrid, the widow of Leif's brother Thorstein, in Greenland, and then organized the most ambitious attempt to permanently settle Vinland that the Norse would ever make. The expedition included livestock cattle brought across the North Atlantic on open ships, and the explicit intention of establishing a colony rather than a temporary camp. They found Leif's houses, settled in, and spent at least 2 winters, possibly 3, in North America. During that time, Gudrid gave birth to a son, Snorri Thorfinnsson, who is recorded as the first child of European descent born in the Americas. He was born around the year 1004 CE, in a place that would not be called America for another 500 years, to parents who called it Vinland and did not yet know how far they had come. The Norse worldview held that certain people were fated to go further than others, and the sagas treat the Vinland explorers as people of this kind. The saga literature has a specific quality of fatedness around the great voyagers, a sense that the journeys they made were not simply individual decisions but expressions of something laid into them before birth. Leif Eriksson is described as a man of good fortune, gafumather, a quality the Norse understood as a combination of luck, personal magnetism, and alignment with the grain of events. Gudrid, who sailed to Vinland and survived its violence, and eventually returned to Iceland and then made a pilgrimage to Rome, is described at the end of her saga as someone who had simply been born to a life of great distances. The Norse did not explain such lives through psychology. They explained them through fate, which was, in the Norse understanding, a way of saying that some people contain their destinies the way a seed contains its tree. L'Anse aux Meadows, in Newfoundland, is the only confirmed Norse site in North America, and its discovery in 1960 changed everything historians thought they knew. The site was found by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad. After Helge spent years consulting old maps and sagas and making a systematic search of the North American coastline for physical evidence of Norse occupation. A local fisherman in Newfoundland led him to a cluster of grass-covered mounds that Ingstad recognized immediately as the characteristic shape of Norse longhouse foundations buried under centuries of turf regrowth. Excavation revealed the remains of 8 buildings, 3 dwelling houses, 4 workshops, and a smithy, along with Norse artifacts including a ringed bronze pin, iron rivets consistent with ship repair, and a stone oil lamp of the type used in Greenland. The site is dated by radiocarbon analysis to around 1000 CE. It is, by every measure of evidence, exactly what it appears to be, the place where the Norse wintered on the edge of North America. Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir is among the most traveled people of the early medieval world and among the least known outside specialist scholarship. She was born in Iceland, sailed to Greenland, spent a terrible winter in a settlement decimated by plague, was widowed, married again, sailed to Vinland, gave birth to the first European child in the Americas, survived Norse indigenous violence, returned to Greenland, returned to Iceland, and then after her second husband died, and she had outlived 2 great transatlantic adventures, sailed to Rome on a pilgrimage. The sagas record that she met the Pope, though whether this is literally true or a mark of how highly the saga tradition regarded her is unclear. She returned to Iceland, became a nun, and spent her final years in contemplation. The scope of her life geographically, experientially exceeds that of almost anyone alive in 1000 CE. She has a statue in Iceland. She deserves considerably more than that. Half the voyage is behind us. We have crossed the North Atlantic, found the shore, met Gudrid and Thorvald and the people under the skin boats, walked the grass-covered mounds of L'Anse aux Meadows. Let everything you have gathered tonight settle. Feel your body against whatever is beneath you, the weight of it, the warmth of it. The Norse were always returning from the sea to the fireside, always finding the hall again after the cold. You are in the hall. The fire is going. Let your breathing slow. Let's continue. Freydís Eriksdóttir, daughter of Erik the Red, led a voyage to Vinland that ended in a mass killing, and the sagas record it without flinching. Freydís organized a joint expedition to Vinland with 2 Icelandic brothers, Helgi and Finnbogi, agreeing to share the use of Leif's houses equally. The agreement broke down over winter for reasons the saga leaves partly unclear. There are suggestions of insult, of broken promises, of the specific combustibility of a small group of people confined together in a dark and distant place through a long winter. In the spring, Freydís had her husband's men kill Helgi, Finnbogi, and their entire crew. The 5 women among the Icelandic party were not killed by the men, reportedly because no one was willing, so Freydís killed them herself with an axe. She returned to Greenland, attempted to swear everyone to silence, and the story came out anyway. Erik the Red's daughter and Leif Eriksson's half-sister committed the first documented mass murder in North America. The saga tells the story plainly. It does not resolve it for you. The Greenlandic Norse maintained contact with North America for decades after the formal settlements ended. Archaeological evidence from Norse Greenland includes objects that could only have come from North America. Butternuts, which do not grow in Greenland, found at a site dating to the 12th or 13th century. Pieces of worked wood from North American species, and a carved wooden figurine that may represent a person in a long robe, possibly a European, possibly an indigenous person, depending on the interpretation. The most compelling evidence for continued contact is a fragment of copper alloy found at a Norse site in the Canadian Arctic, dated to the 13th century, which appears to have originated in Europe, traveled through Norse Greenland, and ended up in an indigenous archaeological context, suggesting that Norse and indigenous people were exchanging objects, and possibly more than objects, across a vast northern territory for 200 years after Leif's voyages. The Norse Greenland settlements, established around 985 CE, survived for nearly 500 years before disappearing entirely in the 15th century. At their peak, the eastern and western settlements of Norse Greenland housed somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people, maintaining farms, a cathedral, 16 parish churches, 2 monasteries, and enough of a surplus economy to export walrus, ivory, furs, and live polar bears to European markets. The western settlement disappeared first, around 1350 CE, a year of profound global disruption, as the Black Death was sweeping Europe. The eastern settlement survived into the 15th century. The last confirmed historical record of the Norse Greenlandic community dates to 1408 CE, describing a wedding at the church at Valsey. After that, silence. No one knows exactly why they vanished. Climate change, the collapse of the ivory trade, plague, conflict with the Inuit who were moving south into their territory, most likely all of these at once, compounding each other in a place with no margin for compound disaster. The Norse had a word, utangarths, for the experience of being outside the enclosure, beyond the known, in the space where ordinary rules did not hold. Utangarths is the opposite of innangarths, within the enclosure, the known world, the place of law and community and warmth. The boundary between them was not merely geographical but moral and metaphysical. Inside was order, the hall, the fire, the known faces. Outside was chaos, the cold, the dark, the face you did not recognize. Every Norse voyage westward into waters that had no bottom on any known chart, toward coasts that appeared and disappeared in the fog, was a movement utangarths. The explorers who made those voyages were people willing to step outside the enclosure and remain functional in the space beyond it. That willingness was not recklessness. It was a specific kind of courage that the Norse culture recognized and honored, the courage of the person who walks out of the firelight and keeps walking. The people of Norse Greenland were ordinary farmers who lived extraordinary lives at the edge of the survivable world. The archaeological record of the Greenlandic settlements is not primarily a record of exploration and adventure. It is a record of people milking cows, making cheese, spinning wool, keeping accounts, burying their dead in the churchyard, carving walrus ivory in the long winter evenings, a comb made from antler, a pair of leather shoes sized for a child, a loom weight, a bronze needle case, the same objects that would have been found in any Norse farmstead in Iceland or Norway, but placed here at the end of a 2-week sea voyage from the nearest community, on a coast where the sea freezes in winter and the growing season is measured in weeks. The ordinariness of those objects in that place is what is extraordinary. These were people making a life, as people do, in whatever place they found themselves. The Norse Greenlandic community had to import almost everything made of wood because Greenland has almost no trees. The treeless landscape of Norse Greenland meant that timber for building, for shipbuilding, for tool handles, for furniture, and for firewood had to be sourced elsewhere, either purchased expensively from Norway or harvested from the driftwood that accumulated on certain Greenlandic beaches. wood that had floated across the Arctic from Siberian river systems and was collected carefully and stored. Vinland's timber was therefore not merely an attractive feature, but a strategic resource of considerable importance to any Greenlandic community. The sagas describe Norse parties sailing to Markland, Labrador, specifically to harvest timber and carrying it back to Greenland. These were not exploratory voyages. They were supply runs, practical, regular, organized around need rather than adventure. The discovery of North America was, from one angle, a solution to a lumber shortage. The Vinland map, announced in 1965 as a pre-Columbian representation of North America, was almost certainly a 20th century forgery. The map, purportedly a 15th century document showing a landmass west of Greenland labeled Vinlanda Insula, was announced by Yale University with considerable fanfare and would, if genuine, have been the earliest known cartographic representation of the Americas. Subsequent analysis was divided for decades, but the accumulated evidence, the composition of the ink, which contains a titanium compound not used in medieval manuscript production, the parchment, which may be genuine medieval material with forged content added to it, and various textual inconsistencies now points fairly strongly toward forgery. The irony is that the Norse discovery of North America does not need the Vinland map to be true. The archaeological evidence at Lens aux Meadows is overwhelming and uncontested. The map's probable forgery tells us more about 20th century anxieties about historical credit than it does about what happened in 1000 CE. The Norse gods themselves were voyagers, and the great myths are, in part, myths about what it means to leave the known world and come back changed. Odin hung for 9 days on Yggdrasil, spearing himself to win the knowledge of the runes from the outer darkness. Thor's journeys to Utgard, the realm of giants, were voyages into the impossible, where nothing was what it appeared and strength alone was not enough. Freyr sailed across the sea in a magical ship called Skithblathnir that could carry all the gods at once and fold up small enough to fit in a pocket. The great Norse myths are full of water, of crossing, of the thing that waits on the other side of the journey. When Leif Eriksson crossed the North Atlantic, he was not departing from his mythology. He was enacting it, living out the pattern his culture had rehearsed in story 1,000 times before anyone actually made the crossing. The ordinary crew members of the Vinland voyages are almost entirely nameless, and the sagas are quietly honest about this. The sagas name Leif, Thorvald, Thorfinn, Gudrid, Freydís. They name Tyrker, the German who found the grapes. They name a few others. But the 30 or 60 or 160 people who crewed the ships, pulled the oars, built the houses, kept watch at night, fished the rivers, and died or survived are recorded only as a number. 35 men, a crew, the company. This is not carelessness on the saga writer's part. It is the convention of the form, which focuses on the people whose actions shaped events, while the rest of the community exists as a kind of weather around them. But those unnamed people were real. Someone repaired the sail, someone dug the latrine, someone, in the long darkness of the Vinland winter, told a story by the fire to keep the fear at a manageable distance. The voyage home from Vinland northeast, against the prevailing winds, was in some ways harder than the voyage out. Sailing from Greenland to Vinland, the Norse had the advantage of running broadly before the westerlies. The prevailing wind system of the North Atlantic blows from west to east, meaning that the outward voyage had the wind partly at the ship's backs. The return voyage reversed this advantage. Ships beating northeast against the wind had to tack sail at angles to the wind, zigzagging across the ocean, covering far more distance than a direct route would require. In the North Atlantic in autumn, with seas building and daylight shortening, this was not an abstract inconvenience. It was a sustained physical challenge lasting weeks. The crews who made those return voyages tired, some of them wounded, all of them cold managed, a navigational achievement that deserves to be remembered, alongside the outward crossing that history has always found more romantic. The climate deterioration that began in the 13th century, known as the Little Ice Age, fundamentally altered the conditions the Norse Greenlanders had built their lives around. The Norse settlements in Greenland were established during a period of relative climatic warmth, the medieval warm period, when sea ice was less extensive and the growing season was marginally longer than it would later become. Beginning in the late 13th century, temperatures across the North Atlantic began to drop. The sea ice expanded, the fjords froze earlier and thawed later. The grazing season shortened. The grain that the Norse could not grow, they were already at the absolute margin of cereal agriculture, became even less possible. Ships from Europe called less frequently, as the ice made navigation more dangerous. The walrus ivory trade that had connected Greenland to European markets collapsed as elephant ivory from African sources flooded the market after the 13th century, destroying the economic justification for maintaining such an expensive and difficult colony. The settlers did not simply give up. The world around them changed until there was nothing left to hold on to. The Norse understood the North as a place of particular power, and the further north one went, the more the world thinned into something else. The Norse cosmology placed the realm of ice, Niflheim, at the root of everything, older than the gods, older than time, the primordial cold from which all things eventually emerged. The North was not merely a direction. It was the direction of origins, of power, of the deep inhuman forces that underlay the human world. To go north, and the Norse Greenlandic settlers went further north than almost any Europeans had gone before, hunting walrus and narwhal and polar bear in the high Arctic was to approach something elemental. The Inuit, who moved south into the territory the Norse occupied, had their own understanding of those northern latitudes, equally ancient, considerably more adapted. Two cosmologies met in the far north, each making sense of the same ice in entirely different ways. Norse ships were built without nails. They were fastened with iron rivets and bound with flexible wooden pegs called tree nails. The structural integrity of a Norse longship did not depend on rigid connections between its components, but on controlled flexibility. Each plank could move slightly relative to its neighbors, distributing the stresses of wave action across the whole hull. The rivets that fastened the overlapping clinker planks were driven through and then bent back, clenched on the inner face, creating a mechanical interlock rather than simply a friction grip. The seams between planks were caulked with wool soaked in pine tar, a material that remained flexible under cold conditions. The whole system was designed to be maintained and repaired in the field. A damaged plank could be replaced without rebuilding the entire hull. Norse ship archaeology, particularly the Oseberg and Gokstad ships found in Norwegian burial mounds, allows us to study these techniques in extraordinary detail, because the burial environment preserved the wood for over 1,000 years. Snorri Thorfinnsson, the first European child born in North America, grew up in Iceland and became a farmer and a Christian. After his birth in Vinland around 1004 CE, Snorri returned to Iceland with his parents and grew up there, apparently unremarkably. The sagas record that he built a church at his farm and had children and grandchildren. He died having traveled further west than any European before him, though whether he was aware, in any meaningful sense, of the scale of what his birth represented is unknowable. He was an infant when it happened. What he knew of Vinland was probably what his mother Gudrid told him stories: the weight of a specific cold, the smell of a particular shore. He is an unusual figure in history, a man whose most historically significant act was being born, in a place he could not remember, to parents who knew they had gone somewhere new but could not have imagined how new. The Norse trading network at its height connected Newfoundland to Constantinople through a chain of human relationships and exchanged goods. Norse traders sailed east as well as west, down the Russian river systems to the Caspian and Black Seas, into the markets of Byzantium and the caliphates of the Islamic world, bringing furs and slaves and amber, and returning with silver and silk and spices. The same culture that sent ships to Newfoundland sent other ships to Baghdad. The walrus ivory from the high Arctic passed through Greenland, to Iceland, to Norway, to the markets of Europe and the Near East. A piece of carved walrus ivory commissioned by a Byzantine merchant in the 11th century, might have begun its life on the shores of the North American Arctic, caught by a Norse Greenlandic hunter, traded south along the coast, processed in a Greenlandic workshop, shipped to Bergen, sold to a Venetian trader, and carried to Constantinople. The world was smaller and larger than we generally imagine. The Norns who wove fate at the base of Yggdrasil were said to water the world tree daily from the well of Urthur, and the water preserved the tree's life. The well was not ordinary water. It was mixed with the clay from around the well, which was so bright and white that everything it touched became that same luminous white. The Norns mixed this clay with water and applied it to the bark of Yggdrasil daily, keeping it alive against the dragon that gnawed its roots from below. The image, 3 women, before the beginning of time, performing a daily act of maintenance on the tree that holds the universe together, is one of the stranger and more quietly beautiful images in Norse mythology. It suggests that existence is not self-sustaining. It requires tending. Someone has to keep showing up every day and do the work of keeping things alive. The Norse settlers in Greenland and Vinland knew this in their bones. Every morning, someone had to feed the animals and milk the cows and repair the turf wall that the wind had pushed in overnight. Existence, at the edge of the world, was the work of showing up. The mystery of what happened to the Norse Greenlandic settlers has never been fully solved. The last written records of the community date to 1408 CE. Archaeological excavation of abandoned Norse farmsteads in Greenland has produced evidence of a community under increasing stress in its final decades, skeletons that show signs of nutritional deficiency, animals that were slaughtered rather than bred, indicating a community drawing down its reserves rather than maintaining them, and the absence of the young adult males who would have been the primary labor force, suggesting that emigration had already begun to hollow out the population before the final collapse. Whether the last Greenlanders died in place or emigrated to Iceland, to Norway, possibly even to North America, is unknown. No mass grave has been found. No account of a final winter has survived. The settlement simply stops, the way a voice stops in the middle of a sentence, and the silence after it has lasted 600 years. The Inuit who moved into former Norse territory found and repurposed Norse objects, and those objects appear in Inuit archaeological contexts hundreds of miles from where they were made. Norse chainmail, Norse barrel staves, Norse woolen textiles, Norse copper and bronze objects all have been found in Inuit archaeological sites, far to the north and west of the Norse settlements, carried through Inuit trade networks across enormous distances. A piece of European bronze that appears to have been cut from a larger object and reworked was found at a site in northern Alaska, thousands of kilometers from Greenland. These objects traveled through a trading world that had its own geography, its own economics, and its own logic, entirely invisible to the European records that documented only the Norse side of the story. The Norse did not move through an empty landscape. They moved through a world that was already full of people, stories, and trade, and those people incorporated the Norse and their objects into their own ongoing history without needing anyone's permission. The last bishop of Greenland was appointed in 1377 CE and apparently never visited his diocese. The Diocese of Gardar in Greenland, established in 1124 CE, with its cathedral built of red sandstone blocks quarried from the local cliffs, was, for 300 years, the westernmost Christian diocese in the world. It sent tithe payments to Rome, received papal letters, and corresponded with the Archbishop of Nidaros in Norway, in the way that distant ecclesiastical outposts communicated with the wider church. And then, as the community contracted and the ships stopped calling, the administrative connection frayed. The last bishop actually to reside in Greenland appears to have done so in the early 14th century. After that, bishops were appointed to Gardar as a kind of sinecure, a title without a territory, a diocese without a congregation. The last such appointee, in 1377, was given the title and presumably never stood on Greenlandic soil. the church kept writing letters to a community that was no longer there to receive them. The Norse discovery of North America is, from one angle, the story of how a civilization reached the limits of what it could sustain. The arc from Norway to Iceland to Greenland to Vinland is a story of extraordinary expansion, each step pushing further into the cold and the unknown, finding new places, building new communities. But each step also stretched the supply lines, the population base, and the environmental conditions that made Norse life possible. Iceland worked. Greenland barely worked for 500 years, and then stopped working. Vinland never worked. The Norse could get there, build there, spend winters there, but they could not hold it against the resistance of the people already living in it. The expansion was genuine and remarkable. The contraction was equally real. The story of the Norse in the North Atlantic is a parable about the outer edge of what a culture can reach, and about what happens when that outer edge cannot sustain the weight of the reaching. We are on the far side of the voyage now. The discovery is behind us. The settlement is behind us. The slow contraction and the silence at the end of it that is behind us too. Take a breath here. Let your body be still. The Norse world understood rest as well as it understood motion, the haul after the sea, the fire after the cold, the story that ends the night and makes the darkness feel inhabited rather than empty. That is what this is. You are in the hall. The fire is going. Let's finish this together. Columbus was aware, before he sailed in 1492, that Norse traditions described land to the northwest and may have taken this information into account. Columbus spent time in Iceland in 1477, 15 years before his famous voyage, and it is inconceivable that he did not hear, in the small seafaring communities of the North Atlantic, the traditions about Vinland and the Norse western voyages. Whether he incorporated this information into his planning is unclear. His voyage went south, not north, and proceeded on the basis of a significantly underestimated Atlantic width rather than known Norse routes. But the Norse knowledge of Western land was not a secret. It was part of the common understanding of European sailors with North Atlantic experience. The world that Columbus entered in 1492 was not as unknown in the European maritime imagination as the story of his voyage is usually told. The ship burials of the Norse, in which the dead were interred in their vessels, reveal what the Norse believed about the journey that came after life. The great ship burials found in Norway at Oseberg, Gokstad, and Thun placed the dead in fully equipped ships, surrounded by everything they might need for a journey: food, tools, animals, servants, weapons, and household goods. The ship was not merely a symbol. It was understood as a vehicle for the crossing that came after death, the passage from this world to the next, over whatever water lay between them. Valhalla was not reached by dying. It was reached by the kind of death that merited entry, and it was reached, implicitly, by sea. The Norse relationship to the ocean was so fundamental that even their cosmology of death was organized around it. To cross the North Atlantic in a longship was to perform, in life, something like the journey the myths said you would make afterward. The Falsey Church, where the last recorded Norse Greenlandic event took place in 1408, still stands in ruins on the shore of a fjord. The Falsey Church is built from local stone, the same red sandstone that makes the ruins look, in certain lights, almost warm against the gray Greenlandic landscape. It is roofless now, the corners still standing to their original height in places, the window embrasures still visible, the interior open to the sky. The wedding recorded there in 1408 was between a man named Thorstein Olafsson and a woman named Sigríður Björnsdóttir. The record of it exists only because the couple subsequently traveled to Norway and had documents drawn up attesting to the legitimacy of their marriage. They brought the wedding into the written record by leaving, which is how we know that at least some Norse Greenlanders were still alive and making marriages and continuing their lives as late as 1408. What happened after that is the silence. The saga of the Greenlanders was written by people who had never seen Vinland, preserving a memory of a place that most of them would never visit. The Icelandic scribes who wrote down the Vinland sagas in the 13th and 14th centuries were recording stories that had been passed through oral tradition for 200 or 300 years. They wrote about a shore they had never stood on, a light they had never seen, a summer they could only imagine. The care with which the sagas preserve certain kinds of detail, the direction of the current, the behavior of the birds, the color of the grasses, the specific shape of a headland, suggests that those details were considered important enough to carry faithfully through centuries of retelling. Someone who had been there told someone who had not, and that person told someone else, and so on down the chain of mouths and ears and winter evenings, until finally someone sat down with a quill and wrote. In those days, Leif Eriksson equipped a ship. The Norse discovery of North America represents a moment when two completely isolated hemispheres of human history briefly touched and then separated again. For roughly 10,000 years before 1000 CE, the populations of the eastern and western hemispheres had evolved independently, biologically, culturally, linguistically, theologically. The plants they cultivated, the animals they domesticated, the diseases they carried, the ideas they had developed about the nature of the world, all of it had diverged along separate tracks for a length of time that makes the subsequent 500 years of contact feel, in cosmic terms, extremely recent. Leif Eriksson's landing in Vinland was the first moment in those 10,000 years when a person from the Eastern Hemisphere voluntarily set foot in the Western and left an identifiable trace. The contact was brief and inconclusive, and ultimately retreated. But the moment itself, two worlds touching at the edge of the cold, uncertain what the other was, is unlike anything else in the human story. The Dorset people, who preceded the Thule Inuit in the high Arctic, had no prior knowledge of Europeans and left no written account of what they saw. The Dorset culture, named for Cape Dorset in Nunavut, occupied the Canadian Arctic and Greenland for thousands of years before Norse contact. They were accomplished hunters, skilled at surviving in some of the most demanding environments on Earth, and they left behind a material culture of considerable artistic beauty, carved ivory and bone figures, often small and intensely detailed, of animals and humans that still communicate, across the silence of the centuries, a quality of close, patient attention to the world. They encountered the Norse. The archaeological record makes this certain, and then they disappeared, absorbed or displaced by the southward expansion of the Thule Inuit, beginning around 1000 CE. What the Dorset people made of the Norse ships, the iron tools, the cattle and sheep, that knowledge went with them. We cannot recover it. We can only acknowledge that it existed. Ragnarok, the end of the gods, was followed, in Norse mythology, by a new world rising from the sea. The final battle, in the Norse telling, destroys most of the gods and much of creation, but it is not the absolute end. Afterward, the earth rises again from the ocean, green and renewed, and the surviving gods find the golden playing pieces of the old world's games lying in the grass, and a new age begins. The Norse did not believe in a universe with a permanent ending. They believed in one with a permanent rhythm of destruction and renewal, of the old world giving way to the new, of the sea swallowing everything and then releasing it again. For a people who lived by the sea and on its margin, this was not an abstract theological position. It was a description of what they watched every day: the tide going out and coming back, the winter ending, the ice breaking, the ship disappearing over the horizon and, if fortune was good, appearing again. The Icelandic sagas, as a literary form, are unlike any other medieval literature, and the Vinland sagas are among their finest examples. Saga style is often described as objective. The narrator rarely tells you what to feel, rarely comments on events, rarely interprets. Things happen, people speak, actions are described with a precision that sometimes borders on the clinical. And then, between the lines of that precision, the emotion exists, not stated but implied, present in what is not said as much as in what is. When Thorvald Eriksson tells his men to bury him on the cape he had chosen and plant crosses at his head and feet, the saga does not tell you that he was brave or sad or resigned. It simply records what he said. The reader supplies the rest. This is not restraint born from lack of feeling. It is a literary technique that trusts the listener to feel more deeply for what is left unsaid than for what is explained. It is, in that sense, a perfect form for a bedtime story. Norse slavery, the thrall system, was integral to the economy of the voyages, and the sagas do not entirely obscure this. The Norse economy depended significantly on enslaved people thralls, who provided agricultural and domestic labor in a society where free labor was scarce and expensive. The slave trade was one of the primary economic activities of the Viking Age. Raids on British and Irish and French coasts brought slaves back to Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland. The Vinland expeditions almost certainly included enslaved people among their crews and settlers. The sagas mention them in passing without commentary. They are part of the landscape of the narrative, present but unremarked upon, the way the wind is present and unremarked upon. A full account of the Norse voyages that does not acknowledge this is a partial account. The people who crossed the North Atlantic to a new world included people who did not choose to make the crossing. L'Anse aux Meadows was not the only Norse site in North America. A copper alloy point found at Point Rosy, Newfoundland, may indicate a second settlement. The search for Norse sites beyond L'Anse aux Meadows has intensified in recent decades, driven by satellite imagery and improved archaeological techniques. In 2016, a site at Point Rosy on the southwest coast of Newfoundland attracted significant attention. Satellite analysis revealed a pattern of subsurface features consistent with Norse construction techniques. An initial excavation turned up a piece of worked bog iron that could be consistent with Norse activity. Subsequent investigation has been more cautious. The site has not been definitively confirmed as Norse, but the search itself reflects something important. The understanding that L'Anse aux Meadows was almost certainly a gateway or base camp, rather than the full extent of Norse activity in North America. The continent was not merely glimpsed. It was entered, traveled, and explored to a depth we are still uncovering. The story of the Norse in North America was effectively lost to mainstream European memory for 5 centuries. When Columbus sailed in 1492, the Norse voyages were not part of the dominant European narrative of the world. The Vinland sagas existed in Icelandic manuscripts, known to scholars of Old Norse literature but unknown to the broader European intellectual world. The Norse Greenlandic settlements had collapsed. The memory of Vinland had retreated into the specific oral culture of Iceland and was only partially visible even there. The recovery of this history, the gradual reconstruction, from the 19th century onward, of what the Norse had actually done is itself a significant intellectual story, one that involves scholars, adventurers, nationalists, forgers, and archaeologists working across 2 centuries to recover a past that had not been lost so much as not yet properly found. Every year, the picture becomes clearer. The Norse rune carvers left marks on stone across the North Atlantic, but no confirmed runic inscription has been found in North America. Runic inscriptions in Scandinavia and Iceland range from brief memorial stones, Ulf raised this stone for his father, to longer commemorative texts recording voyages, battles, and legal agreements. They appear in Greenland, carved on wooden sticks and on the stone church walls at Halsey. The absence of confirmed runes in North America is not surprising. L'Anse aux Meadows was a temporary settlement, likely occupied for only a few winters, and the Norse did not typically carve runes casually. The Kensington runestone, found in Minnesota in 1898, purportedly describing a Norse exploration party from 1362, is almost universally considered a modern forgery by runologists and historians. The Maine penny, a Norse silver coin found at a Native American site in Maine and dated to the 11th century, is genuine Norse and genuinely mysterious, but may have arrived through indigenous trade networks rather than direct Norse contact. The archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, who led the excavations at L'Anse aux Meadows, spent 8 seasons patiently uncovering a site that changed how history was written. When Helga Ingstad identified the grass-covered mounds in 1960, it was Anne Stein, his wife and a trained archaeologist, who ran the excavations. She worked the site from 1961 to 1968, supervising the careful uncovering of building foundations, fireplaces, and artifact deposits that established beyond reasonable doubt that Norse people had been there. The work was slow, meticulous, and conducted at the edge of the world in conditions that were not always comfortable. The artifacts she found, the bronze pin, the iron nail, the stone oil lamp, were small and easy to dismiss if you were not paying attention. She was paying attention. Anne Stein Ingstad gave the Norse discovery of North America its physical reality, the thing that moved it from saga to confirmed history. That is a considerable gift to knowledge. The figure of the sea in Norse mythology is neither friend nor enemy. It is simply the condition of existence for a seafaring people. The Norse did not sentimentalize the ocean. They did not romanticize it into something beautiful and hospitable. They understood it as powerful, indifferent, capable of taking everything in a moment, and also as the medium through which everything worthwhile was reached. Aegir, the Norse sea giant, hosted great feasts for the gods in his hall beneath the waves, feasts at which the beer was served in a cauldron that Thor had specifically retrieved in order to make the party possible. The sea was a host. It was also a killer. Both things were true, and the Norse held both things without needing to resolve the contradiction. To live by the sea was to accept that the world contained things that did not care whether you survived, and to go to sea anyway was the act that defined you. The Norse legacy in North America, brief, contested, ultimately retreated, may have shaped the continent's history in ways that are invisible but real. The objects that moved through Inuit trade networks from Norse Greenland into the North American interior, the copper, the iron, the bronze, may have influenced the material culture and the trade networks of indigenous peoples across a wider area than the direct Norse contact would suggest. Iron was rare and valuable in pre-contact North America, and even small pieces of Norse iron entering indigenous hands would have had effects on the technologies available to the communities that received them. The extent of this indirect influence is difficult to measure, precisely because it passed through intermediaries and left traces that are not always identifiable as Norse in origin. The history of what a brief contact can set in motion through trade, through story, through the physical movement of useful things is longer and stranger than the contact itself. The sagas describe the Vinland landscape with a specificity that suggests the people who told these stories were drawing on real sensory memory. The wild grasses, the shallow rivers full of fish so numerous that nets were not needed, the forests that reached to the shore, the mild winter compared to Greenland's, in which no frost killed the grass and the animals could graze outdoors, the dew on the grass that tasted sweet. These details have the texture of remembered experience rather than invented description. Someone who had been there, who had knelt in the grass and tasted the dew and walked the shore and looked at the trees and thought, "This is better than where I came from." That person's experience is encoded in the saga, not preserved perfectly, not transmitted without distortion across 300 years of oral retelling, but present in the way that the shape of something real persists through its translation into story, slightly altered by each telling but never entirely unrecognizable. The Norse voyages west represent the human impulse toward horizon, the drive, present in every culture, to know what is on the other side. It would be wrong to say the Norse were unique in this. Every human culture has produced explorers, people who walked or paddled or sailed past the known edge and kept going. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific did so on a scale even more extraordinary than the Norse crossing of the North Atlantic. Indigenous peoples had been exploring and mapping the North American continent for thousands of years before Leif Eriksson arrived. The Norse voyages are not unique in their expression of the impulse to know. What makes them historically significant is the specific moment just before the sustained contact, that would change both hemispheres forever, and the specific evidence they left. A cluster of grass-covered building foundations in Newfoundland, a handful of Norse objects in indigenous contexts, and a pair of sagas that refused to let the memory go entirely dark. The continent, the Norse briefly touched, was not empty, and the history of what happened there after sustained contact began in 1492, is one of the great catastrophes of the human record. The Norse retreated from Vinland because the people already living there were too numerous and too resistant to allow a permanent Norse settlement. This is, from one angle, a story of limits. The Norse could discover North America but could not hold it. From another angle, it is a story of a different outcome than the one that followed 500 years later, when European contact with the Americas was sustained and overwhelming and carried with it diseases to which the indigenous populations had no immunity. The Norse did not spark an epidemic. They did not persist long enough to fundamentally alter the world they had reached. The encounter remained, in both directions, something that could be absorbed. The later contact was not like that. The contrast is not a comfortable one to sit with, but it is part of the story. The Norse believed that the dead could be asked for wisdom, and that wisdom, given freely, was one of the most valuable things in the world. The Eddic poems describe Odin sitting at the base of Yggdrasil and asking the Völva the seeress to speak from her death about what she knew. She tells him the history of the world, the fate of the gods, and what comes after Ragnarok, and then she sinks back into the silence she came from. Wisdom, in the Norse imagination, was not always comfortable. It did not always arrive in a form you could use, but it was worth seeking, worth the discomfort of the asking. The sagas were a kind of collective, asking a culture reaching back into its own dead past and saying, "What do you know?" And the past answered, as it always does, in stories. The stories were not complete. They were not perfectly accurate, but they were real, and they were offered, and they have lasted. The Norse trading voyages into Russia, the Varangian routes, are as extraordinary as the Western voyages, and are less often told. While some Norse peoples sailed west to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, others sailed east into the river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine, trading furs and slaves and amber for silver from the Islamic world and silk from Byzantium. The Volga trade route connected the Baltic Sea to the Caspian. The Dnieper route connected it to the Black Sea and Constantinople. Norse merchants called Varangians by the Byzantines and Rus by the Slavic populations they encountered, established trading posts that eventually became cities. Novgorod, Kiev, the nucleus of what would become Russia. The name Russia itself may derive from Rus, the Norse term for the oarsmen who worked the river routes. The culture that looked west to Vinland also looked east to Baghdad, and both directions were expressions of the same restless, nautical, commercially minded civilization. The Norse settlement at Lonso Meadows included a smithy, the westernmost ironworking site in the medieval world. The smithy at Lonso Meadows, identified by the presence of a furnace, iron slag, and bog iron ore, produced iron objects for ship repair and possibly other purposes. The presence of a smithy confirms that this was not simply a brief stopover but a substantial base of operations. You do not build a smithy for a one-winter stay. The iron technology the Norse brought to North America was, at the time, absent from indigenous culture. In that region, copper was used extensively, but smelted iron was not. The smithy at Lonso Meadows represents a brief moment in which iron technology was present on the North American continent in European hands, and then was removed with the Norse when they left. The technology arrived with them, it left with them, it would not arrive again, to stay, for another 500 years. The Greenlandic Norse maintained a surprising level of cultural connection to Iceland and Norway throughout their 5 centuries of existence. Ship traffic between Norway and Greenland, while never frequent, was regular enough to maintain language, law, and cultural continuity across the North Atlantic. Icelandic bishops visited the Greenlandic diocese. Greenlandic merchants traveled to Norwegian markets. Young men from Greenland went to Iceland or Norway to be educated. The sagas were known in Greenland. The community that had produced the Vinland voyages was aware that its history was being told, that its founders had become literary figures. This cultural connection sustained the Greenlandic identity as something more than a purely local phenomenon. The settlers at the edge of the world considered themselves part of a Norse community that stretched from Ireland to Russia, and they were not wrong. The connection lasted as long as the ships kept coming. When the ships stopped, the connection frayed, and the community eventually frayed with it. The word discovery, in the context of the Norse voyages, contains a problem that the word itself cannot resolve. The Norse did not discover North America in any meaningful sense, if discovery requires that the place be previously unknown. It was entirely known to the millions of people who lived there, had lived there for at least 15,000 years, and had developed sophisticated cultures, trade networks, agricultural systems, and cosmologies that were in no way dependent on Norse knowledge of their existence. What the Norse did was something more specific. They established the first known contact from the Eastern Hemisphere with the Western, and they left an archaeological trace that allows us to date that contact and place it in a specific geography. That is worth knowing. It is worth telling. But it is worth telling accurately as a story about what the Norse did, not as a story about a continent that was waiting to be found by people who had not yet found it. The final voyage of the Norse imagination, Odin's ride on Sleipnir across all 9 worlds, is a journey with no destination other than knowledge. Odin on his 8-legged horse Sleipnir does not travel to conquer or to settle or to trade. He travels to know, to gather information, to understand what is happening in each of the 9 worlds, to accumulate the wisdom that an uncertain future demands. He pays for knowledge repeatedly. 1 eye, 9 days on the world tree, humiliation in the hall of a giant who bested him in a riddling contest. He keeps paying because the alternative comfortable ignorance is not compatible with what he is. The Norse explorer who sailed into unknown water to find out what was there was, in this sense, performing a sacred act by the logic of his own mythology. To not know was to be less. To go and find out was to be fully what a person could be. The sea was the price. The knowledge was worth it. The Vinland sagas, read carefully, contain information that helped archaeologists identify the correct latitude and ecology of the Norse settlement. Specific ecological details in the sagas, the presence of salmon in the rivers, the wild grapes or berries, the particular quality of the winter, allowed researchers to narrow the plausible location of the Norse settlement to the northeastern coast of North America. Salmon are not found south of the Hudson River. Grapes or lingonberries grow across Newfoundland and the maritime provinces. The mild winter described in the sagas is consistent with the climate of southern Newfoundland. The sagas are not field guides, and the details were not placed there to assist future archaeologists. But they encode the memory of a real environment with enough fidelity that, 1,000 years later, people could use them to find the place. That is a remarkable thing for a story to do. The children who grew up in the Norse Greenlandic settlements had a childhood unlike any other in the medieval world. They grew up at the edge of the known world, in communities of a few hundred people at most, where everyone knew everyone, and the margin between survival and disaster was measured in the thickness of the turf wall and the amount of hay stored for the winter. They learned to handle small boats before they could walk steadily on land. They knew the names of every bird that flew over the fjord and what each one indicated about the weather. They knew that somewhere to the west, past the ice, there was a shore where their grandparents had gone and found timber and berries and a different kind of difficulty. Whether any of them ever sailed that way themselves following the family memory west to the shore that had been abandoned is not recorded. But the knowledge was there, in the community, passed from mouth to ear in the long evenings of the Greenlandic winter. The abandonment of the western settlement in Greenland appears to have happened suddenly and left animals alive in the abandoned farmsteads. The Icelandic priest Ivar Bardsson, who traveled to the western settlement around 1350 CE to investigate reports of its abandonment, found the farms empty of people but with livestock still present. Cattle, sheep, and horses wandering the meadows and the buildings without anyone to tend them. He found no Norse people and no bodies. He found only the animals, uncared for, surviving on their own in the empty farms. Whether the settlers had died, emigrated, or been taken by violence or by their own decision, he could not determine. He brought some of the livestock back to the eastern settlement and filed his report. The image he left animals wandering through the empty halls, the turf beginning to grow back over the threshold, the Norse world receding from its furthest point, is one of the strangest and quietest endings in medieval history. The reconstruction of a Norse longship at full scale, and the sailing of that reconstruction across the North Atlantic, confirmed what the saga accounts had long suggested. In 1893, a replica of the Gokstad ship, a well-preserved Viking-age longship, found in a Norwegian burial mound, sailed from Bergen to New York in 28 days, demonstrating that the Norse ships were entirely capable of sustained North Atlantic voyaging. More recent experimental voyages, using reconstructions of various Norse ship types, have confirmed the ship's seakeeping qualities, their speed in favorable conditions, and their survivability in the kind of storms the North Atlantic routinely produces. The sailors who have made these voyages in modern replicas well-fed, with modern safety equipment, able to call for rescue if things go badly wrong, report that the experience is extraordinarily demanding, even with those advantages. The men and women who made the original crossings with none of them did something that genuine experience, not just scholarship, confirms was remarkable. Norse burial practices changed significantly after the conversion to Christianity, and the transition is visible in the archaeological record. Before the conversion, which came to Iceland around 1000 CE and to Norway and Greenland at roughly the same time, Norse burial included grave goods, the objects the dead would need for whatever came next. Ship burials, weapon burials, animal sacrifices, the interment of horses and dogs alongside their owners, all of these reflect a theology of the afterlife that required material preparation. After the conversion, Christian burial practiced simple inhumation in consecrated ground, oriented east-west, without grave goods replaced this. The transition is not always clean in the archaeological record. Some burials contain both a cross and a traditional amulet, suggesting individuals or communities negotiating between two cosmologies at once. The Greenlandic church cemeteries, excavated by modern archaeologists, reveal a community that made this transition and then buried its dead, generation after generation, in the same consecrated ground until there were no more generations to bury. The Norse understood memory mini as one of the sacred substances of the world, something that could sustain the living and honor the dead. At the great feasts of the Norse world, memory cups mini were drunk in honor of the dead and the gods, toasting specific names, specific acts, specific moments of courage or generosity that were worth remembering. To be remembered to have your name spoken aloud at such a feast was to continue existing in a meaningful sense after death. The sagas themselves are mini on a vast scale, the culture's act of drinking a toast to the people who had gone before and done things worth recounting. Leif Eriksson has been toasted, in this sense, for 1,000 years. Gudrid, Thorvald on his cape, the unnamed 35 who crossed the ocean, their names, spoken in the dark, in a story told in the warm that is the Norse version of eternity, and it is still working. The Greenlanders, who did not emigrate, who stayed until the end, may have found their own accommodation with the Inuit moving south. The evidence for Norse Inuit contact in Greenland is scattered but persistent. Norse objects in Inuit middens, Inuit carvings of figures in European-style clothing, the possibility of shared hunting territory and, perhaps, shared knowledge. Some researchers have proposed that the Norse who survived the worst of the demographic collapse may have integrated, to some degree, with Inuit communities intermarrying, adopting Inuit subsistence techniques, becoming something that was neither purely Norse nor purely Inuit, but a mixed thing at the edge of the world. This is speculative and contested. The evidence does not confirm it clearly, but it is worth holding as a possibility that the end of Norse Greenland was not an extinction but a transformation, that some of the blood and some of the memory of those 5 centuries at the world's edge survived in the communities that replaced the formal Norse settlements. The Norse story of Vinland is, ultimately, a story about what gets remembered and what gets lost, and why that difference matters. For 500 years, the Norse discovery of North America was not part of the story the world told itself about the beginning of the European encounter with the Americas. Columbus was the name. 1492 was the date. The Norse voyages existed in Icelandic manuscripts and in the quiet persistence of a scholarly tradition that kept working, kept arguing, kept looking for the physical evidence that would make the sagas undeniable. And then, in 1960, a Norwegian explorer followed a local fisherman's directions to a cluster of grass-covered mounds in Newfoundland, and the world's story changed not dramatically, not overnight, but permanently. What had been a saga became a confirmed history. What had been a literary tradition became an archaeological fact. The memory held. After 1,000 years, the memory held. The Baffin Island Norse site Tanfield Valley may push the known extent of Norse North American activity significantly further north. Archaeological work at Tanfield Valley on Baffin Island, conducted over several decades, has produced artifacts and materials that some researchers interpret as evidence of Norse indigenous contact. Yarn spun in the Norse manner, pelts cut with metal blades, a piece of worked wood with a tally mark notch of the type used in Norse accounting. The evidence is debated, and the interpretation of contact sites is inherently complex when the two cultures did not leave written records of their interactions. But the accumulating body of potential contact sites from Newfoundland north to Baffin Island and west into the Canadian Arctic suggests that the Norse relationship with North America was significantly more extensive than the 2 or 3 sagas that describe it would indicate. The sagas record what was worth telling. They do not record everything that happened. The final image of the Norse cosmos, after Ragnarok, after the destruction of everything, is of green fields emerging from the sea. When the old world ends and the new one rises, the surviving gods walk through grass that is growing where the sea had been. They find the golden game pieces of the old world lying in the meadow, and they sit down, and they begin to talk about what had happened, about the things they remembered, and the things they had lost, and the world that had been, and was, now new. The myth ends not in triumph, and not in tragedy, but in something quieter, a conversation between survivors, in a green place, about what it had all meant. That image, the sea giving back what it took, the grass covering the ruins. The survivors, sitting with their memories in the new light, is as good an image as any for what it means to be the inheritors of a history that was almost lost. You are sitting in that field. The game pieces are there in the grass. The story is being remembered right now by you. Helge Ingstad, the explorer who identified Lance O Meadows, was 72 years old when the site was confirmed, and he had spent decades pursuing a conviction that most of his peers considered unlikely. Ingstad had been a lawyer, a fur trapper in the Canadian North, an explorer, and a writer before he became the man who found the Norse settlement in Newfoundland. He had spent years reading the sagas and plotting the likely course of the Norse voyages on maps, and then physically visiting the coastline, site by site, asking local people if they knew of any old ruins or unusual earthworks. The fisherman who led him to Lance O Meadows in 1960, George Decker, whose family had lived near the site for generations, is part of the discovery story too, though he is less often named. Ingstad recognized what he saw because he had spent years preparing himself to recognize it. Persistence and preparation, arriving at the right moment, in the presence of the right person. That is how the Norse came back into history. The Norse voyages to North America are now woven into the official historical record of Canada, and Lance O Meadows is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The site was designated in 1978 in the first round of UNESCO World Heritage listings, one of the few North American sites included in that inaugural group, a recognition of its global significance as the only confirmed pre-Columbian European site in the Americas. The Canadian government manages and preserves it. Archaeologists continue to work in the surrounding area, looking for additional evidence of Norse activity. The site has been reconstructed and part 3 of the buildings have been rebuilt using Norse techniques, and during the summer months, they are staffed by interpreters in Norse dress who demonstrate crafts and explain the sagas. Thousands of visitors travel to the northern tip of Newfoundland each year to stand where Leif Eriksson's crew built their fires, where Gudrid's child was born, where the first European iron was smelted in North America. It is a remote and beautiful place. The wind off the Labrador Sea is cold even in August. The grass is very green. The discovery of America by the Norse was, in one sense, a failure, and in another sense, an extraordinary success. It failed as a colonial enterprise. The Norse could not hold Vinland against the resistance of its inhabitants and the logistical strain of maintaining a settlement at such a distance from their base in Greenland. The settlement was abandoned, the voyages became infrequent, and the memory of them retreated into the oral tradition of Iceland without reshaping the broader European understanding of the world's geography. In that narrow sense, the voyages accomplished nothing permanent, but they demonstrated, definitively, that the North Atlantic could be crossed, that the world extended westward, beyond the known horizon, and that human beings with a good ship and enough determination could reach it. That knowledge, encoded in the sagas, waited 500 years, and when it was recovered, when the archaeological evidence confirmed what the sagas had always said, it changed how the human story understood itself. Odin, in the Norse myths, is perpetually in danger of losing the wisdom he has sacrificed so much to gain, and this makes him perpetually in motion. He cannot rest in what he knows, because the world keeps changing, and knowledge that was sufficient yesterday may be inadequate tomorrow. He rides across the 9 worlds not because he enjoys the journey, but because the alternative, staying still, trusting that what he already knows is enough, is fatal in a universe moving toward Ragnarok. The Norse explorers had something of this quality, a constitutive restlessness, a sense that the world beyond the known edge was always relevant, always potentially containing something that mattered, always worth the crossing. It was not comfortable. It was not always safe. It was the condition of people who understood that knowledge was not a possession, but a practice, something you had to keep doing, keep pursuing, keep willing to pay for. The grass at Lonso Meadows grows over the mounded foundations of the Norse buildings in exactly the same way it grew over them for 1,000 years before anyone knew what lay beneath. The site does not announce itself. The mounds are low and green and easy to walk past without understanding what they are. For centuries, the local Newfoundland population knew of the bumps in the ground and assumed various explanations: old Inuit structures, natural landforms, the work of some previous local inhabitants. It took someone who had spent years reading a 1,000-year-old saga in Old Norse and who had been looking specifically for this shape in the landscape to recognize what it was. History is like that often. The past is present, visible, right there beneath your feet. And what is required to see it is not extraordinary perception, but the specific preparation that allows you to know what you are seeing when you see it. The mounds were always there. It was the eyes to read them that had to be cultivated. The Norse discovery of North America is a story about what it costs to reach the edge of the possible and what remains after the reaching. The cost was real. The ships that did not make it back, the settlements that could not be held, the people who died on strange shores without burial rites in their own tradition, the civilization that contracted and disappeared at its furthest extension. None of that should be minimized. But the remaining is also real. The sagas, the mounds, the bronze pin under the turf, the chant of Gudrid's name in the scholarly literature, the wind off the Labrador Sea that is the same wind that filled Norse sails 1,000 years ago. Something persists. The reaching left a mark, faint and far and cold, on the edge of the world. We found it. We keep finding it, year by year, shovel by shovel, in the patient archaeology of a civilization that refused, even in its disappearance, to be entirely forgotten. The study of Old Norse language has undergone a quiet revival in recent decades, and with it, a fresh reading of the saga literature. The Vinland sagas have been retranslated several times in the past 50 years, and each new translation brings different nuances into focus. Scholars who have approached the texts with new questions about indigenous contact, about the role of women, about the environmental conditions of the voyages, about the relationship between oral tradition and written text, have found that the sagas contain information that earlier readings overlooked or minimized. The sagas are not finished documents. They are living texts that keep revealing new things as the questions brought to them change. A graduate student reading the saga of the Greenlanders in Old Norse in a university library today may find something that no one has noticed before: a detail in the ecological description, a nuance in the account of a conversation, a small inconsistency that opens into a larger question. The saga invites this. It always has. In the Norse tradition, the sea had its own name for itself, and the word humans used was a kind of translation, always slightly off. The Norse had more than 20 distinct words for the sea, distinguishing between open ocean and coastal waters, between calm and rough, between the sea as an obstacle and the sea as a road. The sea in Norse poetry is the whale's way, the gull's home, the seal's field, the ship's road, a shifting collection of kennings that circle around the thing itself without claiming to name it precisely. This linguistic humility, the acknowledgement that the sea exceeds any single description, reflects something true about what the Norse experienced. The North Atlantic does not have a single face. It is 1,000 different conditions in the course of a single crossing, each one demanding a different response, a different name, a different understanding. The voyagers who crossed it did not master it. They negotiated with it every day on its own terms. The last entry in the ecclesiastical records of Norse Greenland, dated 1409, describes a trial for witchcraft at the church at Falsey. The record of the Falsey wedding in 1408 is accompanied by another document from 1409, describing a witchcraft trial that took place in the same community. A man named Kolgrimr was burned at the stake for seducing a woman named Steinunn Raffnsdottir through sorcery. The woman was apparently considered a victim rather than an accomplice, which is a detail worth noting. The case was heard at the Thing, the Norse Assembly, and dealt with according to Norse legal procedure. The formal apparatus of Norse legal and ecclesiastical life was still functioning in Greenland in 1409, at the outermost edge of the Norse world, within a few decades of the community's final disappearance. People were doing the ordinary things of a functioning society, getting married, making accusations, holding trials, maintaining the forms of a civilization, and then, very soon after, they were gone. The Norse story of the Western voyages is a gift the past gave the future, wrapped in the particular container that gifts travel best in, which is story. The people who made the Vinland voyages did not know they were giving anything to anyone. They were solving problems, finding timber, exploring territory, trying to establish settlements that would ease the pressure on Greenland's limited resources. They were not building a legacy. They were living their lives. But the stories they told when they came home, and the stories their children told, and the stories their children's children told, turned the facts of their voyages into something that could survive the loss of every other trace. The sagas carried the memory through 5 centuries of political change, cultural shift, and the disappearance of the very communities that had produced them. And when the physical evidence was finally found, the mounds, the pin, the slag, the sagas were there to explain what it was. The story recognized the thing. The thing confirmed the story. That is how the past speaks, when it speaks at all. The voyage is not over, and the Norse story of North America is still being told, revised, and extended by every new discovery. Every few years, a new piece of evidence emerges from the permafrost, or the peat, or the bottom of a bay, an artifact in an unexpected location, an isotopic analysis that places a Norse object in indigenous hands, a new radiocarbon date that revises the timeline slightly. The picture is more complete than it was in 1960, and less complete than it will be in 2060. The Vinland sagas, read alongside the archaeology, alongside the environmental data, alongside the indigenous oral traditions that were not written down but have their own ways of persisting together. They form a picture of an encounter that mattered, in ways we are still learning to articulate. The longship that sailed west 1,000 years ago is still, in some sense, still sailing. The horizon it was headed toward is still further than we can see from where we stand. That is the nature of voyages worth making. Tonight we sailed together across the gray North Atlantic from the World Tree at the center of the Norse cosmos, past the longships and the trading routes, and the 3-week crossing into unknown water. We walked the shore with Leif, and stood at Thorvald's grave on a cape we cannot name, and we listened to Gudrid's extraordinary life, from Iceland to Vinland to Rome and back again. We uncovered the grass-mounded foundations of a smithy at the edge of the world, and we learned that the saga held what the shovel eventually confirmed, and that memory, if tended carefully enough, can outlast 1,000 years of silence. The sea is behind us now. We are in the hall. The fire is low. If this channel has become part of how you rest, we would be genuinely glad if you subscribed, not for our sake, but so that the next tired traveler searching for a softer place to land might find their way here. One small gesture, and someone else gets a quieter night. That seems like the right kind of gift to give. Let everything go now. Let your jaw go soft, feel it release. Let your shoulders fall from wherever they have been holding. Let your breath slow until it asks nothing of you but its own simple rhythm. Somewhere tonight, the North Atlantic is moving in the dark, great gray swells rolling west, the same water that carried Norse longships 1,000 years ago, cold and deep and indifferent and beautiful. The sea does not remember the ships, but we do. We hold the memory of the crossing of Leif at the prow in the gray morning, of Gudrid with her child on a shore that had no name yet, of the unnamed 35 who pulled their oars through water that had never felt the weight of a European vessel. You have come a long way tonight. You have done enough. Sleep well, and good night.